Tampa, Florida, this is Democracy Now!
The regime does not fight terrorism. It's actually the single biggest cause of terrorism in Syria. It is the cause of ISIS in Syria. And if you talk to Syrians, Bashar al-Assad and the regime is the biggest terrorist in the country.
As President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin agree to seek a ceasefire in Syria, we speak to journalist Anand Gopal. But first, we look at the plight of 55,000 Haitians, most here in Florida, who could face deportation if the Trump administration does not extend their temporary protected status enacted after the devastating earthquake of 2010. And we go back to North Carolina to look at how a group of African-American residents are fighting back against factory farms that spray liquid hog manure on their communities.
You don't open the doors up, the windows, but the odor still comes in. It takes your breath away. Then you start gagging, you get headaches.
I shut my hog operation down, and I got out of it. And I just couldn't do another person that way to make them smell that.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're reporting from Tampa, Florida. President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed Tuesday during a phone call to work together to seek a ceasefire in Syria. According to the Kremlin, Putin and Trump agreed to meet in July to discuss a resolution to the protracted conflict. Reporters were not able to ask questions about Trump's phone call on Tuesday. However, because White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer stormed out of Tuesday's press briefing without taking questions, as reporters shouted, "Sean, Sean," as he departed. Trump and Putin's phone call came the same day ISIS militants attacked a makeshift camp for displaced Syrians and Iraqi refugees, killing nearly 40 civilians and Kurdish fighters near Syria's northeastern border with Iraq. We'll have more on the ongoing conflict in Syria later in the broadcast with journalist Anand Gopal. Meanwhile, President Trump is meeting with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas at the White House today. Trump already hosted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in February. In Afghanistan, at least 8 civilians were killed and 28 more wounded in a suicide bombing in Kabul. Officials say the target of the attack was a NATO convoy. 3 U.S. soldiers were wounded in the attack. ISIS militants claim responsibility for the attack. On Capitol Hill, the Republicans' new bill to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act is facing major opposition from key members within the Republican Party, casting doubt on whether the latest effort will garner enough votes to pass the House. On Tuesday, Michigan Republican Congressman Fred Upton came out against the legislation, saying it does not protect people with pre-existing conditions. Upton is the former chair of a House committee that helped draft an earlier version of the Republican health care bill. Trump has repeatedly claimed the latest bill guarantees coverage for people with pre-existing conditions, even though the bill would actually allow insurance companies to charge them significantly higher premiums. The Republicans' previous effort to pass a health care bill failed in March due to party infighting. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, more than 100 people gathered for a vigil Tuesday after the Justice Department announced it will not bring charges against 2 white police officers for the 2016 killing of Alton Sterling, an African-American father of 5. Bystander video shows Sterling was pinned to the ground by the 2 police officers when one of them shot him. His killing sparked nationwide protests. This is community organizer Arthur Silky Slim Reed speaking at the vigil Tuesday outside the Triple S convenience store where Sterling was killed.
Let this be a wake-up call to you. Don't keep begging for justice. Show them what justice looks like. Stand up, be strong, and refuse to bend. This is an unjust situation. Alton Sterling did not have to die.
It was the Justice Department's first high-profile decision. on whether to charge police officers for killing civilians since President Trump took office. Trump has repeatedly vowed to be pro-police and pro-law enforcement. Hours after his inauguration, the Trump administration took down the White House website's pages on civil rights and replaced them with a page entitled "Standing Up for Our Law Enforcement Community." Meanwhile, in Charleston, South Carolina, former white police officer Michael Slater has pleaded guilty to shooting and killing African-American Walter Scott in 2015. Video footage shows Scott was unarmed and running away from Officer Slater when Slater opened fire, shooting Scott 8 times in the back, killing him. Slater pleaded guilty to a federal civil rights charge. He'd also been tried for murder, but a judge declared a mistrial in that case in 2016 after jurors couldn't reach a verdict. Slater now faces the possibility of life in prison. This is Walter Scott's brother, Anthony Scott.
We will never be able to share Walter again as a brother. Here's laughter, here's jokes, him sing a song. We will never be able to share that with, and never again. That's gone for us forever. But I hope he's looking down and saying, good job, job well done. Appreciate you standing in there for me, brother and family. Y'all stuck it through, and you made sure that I got the justice.
Meanwhile, in Texas, the Balch Springs Police Department has fired police officer Roy Oliver, who killed 15-year-old Jordan Edwards on Saturday, shooting the African-American teenager in the head while he was in a car leaving a party. Former acting Attorney General Sally Yates is slated to testify before a Senate committee next week, in which she'll reiterate that she warned the White House about former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn nearly 3 weeks before he was fired. Yates says she told White House counsel Don McGahn on January 26 that Flynn was lying both publicly and privately about whether he discussed U.S. sanctions on Russia in his conversation with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak in December, and that she thought these lies made Flynn vulnerable to being blackmailed. Former House Intelligence Committee Chair Devin Nunes canceled hearings in March in an apparent effort to block Yates' testimony after she and former CIA head John Brennan, who was slated to testify at the same hearing, informed the government they would contradict some statements the White House officials had made. Former Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton claimed that FBI Director James Comey and Russian hacking cost her the U.S. election during an interview Tuesday.
I was on the way to winning until the combination of Jim Comey's letter on October 28th and Russian WikiLeaks raised doubts in the minds of people who were inclined to vote for me but got scared off. If the election had been on October 27th, I'd be your president.
That's Hillary Clinton referring to the day before FBI Director James Comey sent that letter to lawmakers saying the FBI was once again investigating whether Clinton had sent classified information from her private email server while she was Secretary of State. Comey is testifying to the Senate Judiciary Committee today. In response to Clinton's comments, Trump tweeted, quote, "Trump-Russia story was an excuse used by the Democrats as justification for losing the election. Perhaps Trump just ran a great campaign, ? He asked. In Greece, international creditors have once again forced the Greek government to impose austerity measures in exchange for another round of bailouts. The austerity measures include raising taxes and cutting pensions. This is an 80-year-old pensioner in Athens.
When will pensioners finally stop paying for this? This is our money. We've been working for 40 years, and unfortunately, they're taking it, and now we don't have enough to live on. It's a shame that they have reached such a level that they have to exploit people who are in the last stages of their lives. This is really terrible.
The Washington Post reports videos of President Trump and his daughter Ivanka promoting Trump Tower in the Philippines were featured on the skyscraper's website until this week. This is a clip of the video, which was filmed in 2013.
Trump Tower Manila will be something very, very special, like nobody's seen before.
This promotional video remained on the skyscraper's website until the Washington Post asked about it earlier this week, and it was subsequently taken down. Trump developed the skyscraper outside the capital, Manila, with one of the Philippines' most powerful real estate moguls, who is currently Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte's top trade envoy. Over the weekend, President Trump invited Duterte to visit the White House, sparking outrage from human rights experts who say the invitation condones the thousands of extrajudicial killings in the Philippines since Duterte launched his so-called war on drugs. Meanwhile, CNN has refused to air an ad from the Trump campaign that calls the mainstream media fake news. CNN says it won't air the ad because it's false. In response, the Trump campaign lashed out at CNN, accusing the network of censorship. Kentucky Republican Governor Matt Bevin is threatening to close the state's only remaining abortion clinic, meaning Kentucky could become the first U.S. state without a single women's health clinic that provides abortion. The ACLU has sued Kentucky on behalf of the last remaining clinic, the EMW Women's Surgical Center in Louisville. Kentucky has been forced to shut 16 abortion clinics since 1978 amidst a slew of increasingly harsh anti-choice legislation. It's now one of 7 U.S. states with only a single clinic remaining. In Washington state, imprisoned immigrant women continue a hunger strike at the for-profit Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington. Organizers say some of the hunger strikers have faced threats of forced transfers or forced medical treatment from GEO Group, the company that operates the prison. Organizers also say the strike has also spread across the state lines to Norcourt Jail in Oregon, which contracts with Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency known as ICE to imprison immigrants, including some transferred from the Tacoma prison. Meanwhile, in Texas, a state representative has admitted that the anti-immigrant bill he introduced into the state legislature was actually written by the for-profit prison company GEO Group. Republican State Representative John Rainey said, quote, "I've known the lady who is their lobbyist for a long time. That's where the legislation came from." The bill would allow Texas prisons that hold immigrant families to be classified as child care facilities, meaning ICE could imprison women and children for longer stretches of time. The legislation, if passed, would directly benefit one of GEO Group's for-profit prisons, Karnes County Correctional Center in Texas. Journalist and activist Barrett Brown has been released from federal prison after he was rearrested Thursday, only one day before he was slated to be interviewed for an upcoming PBS documentary. He was imprisoned for unknown reasons. His rearrest came after he served 4 years behind bars on charges related to the hacking of the private intelligence firm Stratfor, which exposed how the firm spied on activists on behalf of corporations. Last year, Barrett Brown won the National Magazine Award for prison columns for a series of columns he wrote for The Intercept. United CEO Oscar Munoz and other airline executives testified to the House of Representatives Transportation Committee Tuesday amidst the ongoing fallout about the violent removal of a doctor who refused to be involuntarily rebooked from a flight. Viral video shows a bloody Dr. David Dow being dragged semi-conscious down the aisle of a United jet by airline security officers. Dr. Dow reportedly suffered a concussion, a broken nose, and lost teeth during the violent removal. Despite expressing outrage over the incident, lawmakers did not say they would move to impose more regulation on the industry, which was deregulated in the late 70s, leading to massive mergers and near monopolies by the 4 major airline carriers. Instead, lawmakers called on the industry to self-regulate. This is Arkansas Republican Congressman Rick Crawford.
I don't want to jump into a competitive model and apply re-regulation, but that means that the industry has to do some self-regulation to demonstrate that you don't need interference from Congress.
I couldn't agree more.
And that's United CEO Oscar Munoz saying he couldn't agree more that the airline industry should regulate itself. And in New York City, the historic Riverside Church has announced it'll divest its $140 million endowment from fossil fuels. The church was founded by John Rockefeller Jr., the son of the founder of Standard Oil. In response, 350.org co-founder Bill McKibben said, quote, 50 years after Dr. King used its pulpit to call for an end to the war in Vietnam, Riverside Church now issues a call of its own for a future free of fossil fuels where the gospel call to love one's neighbor can be carried out effectively around the world, McKibben wrote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Tampa, Florida. The Sunshine State, particularly southern Florida, is home to a very large, vibrant Haitian population, with many living in the Miami neighborhood of Little Haiti. Well, the Haitian-American community is now facing a looming deportation deadline. Up to 55,000 Haitians could be forcefully repatriated to their fragile, struggling homeland if the Trump administration refuses to extend a temporary protected status that's allowed them to legally reside and work in the U.S. after an earthquake devastated Haiti in 2010. Haitians' temporary protected status, known as TPS, is set to expire July 22nd. Earlier this month, the acting director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, James McCament, wrote a letter to Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly suggesting the Haitians should be deported as early as January. In the letter, McCament said conditions in Haiti have improved considerably. His conclusion and recommendation contradicts an assessment done by the Obama administration in December. Under Obama, the State Department examined the same circumstances and recommended Haitians be allowed to remain in the United States. Immigrant rights advocates note Haiti is still reeling from Hurricane Matthew, which in October 2016 destroyed the country's southwest peninsula. The hurricane killed more than 1,000 people and decimated villages and farmland. Haiti's also suffering from a devastating cholera epidemic that erupted after the earthquake. On the campaign trail in September, Donald Trump visited Little Haiti in Miami, Florida, and vowed to be a champion for the Haitian-American community.
Whether you vote for me or you don't vote for me, I really want to be your greatest champion, and I will be your champion, whether you vote for me or not.
That was Donald Trump speaking last year in Little Haiti. Well, for more, we're joined now in Miami, Florida, by Marlene Bastien, Executive Director of Haitian Women of Miami. Marlene, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you talk about what you understand is happening right now to the Haitian community who came to the U.S. under temporary protected status?
Good morning, Amy, and thank you so much for having me. Well, as you clearly indicated, over 50,000 Haitians, some who have been living in the U.S. for an average of 7.5 to 15 years, who have made their lives here, built their families, their homes, and businesses here, are facing deportation to Haiti. So Haiti, as we know, is not equipped and ready to absorb all these refugees. And when President Obama approved TPS, it was for so that Haiti has a chance to recover. And we know, based on what we've heard, that Haiti has yet to recover. Not only that it's suffering for all the natural disasters that you mentioned, the imported cholera epidemic, and Hurricane Matthew, which destroyed all the crops and livestock, forcing people to live in caves. So these people are really living in fear of deportation because they have their families to consider, they have their businesses to consider, they have their homes, to consider. So it is really creating and wreaking havoc in thousands of families in this country.
Can you describe Little Haiti to us? Last night, we were just in Miami. I was speaking to a Haitian man who talked about the fear that the whole community is facing right now. How many Haitians live in Miami? And the 55,000, though, goes well beyond Miami, right? It's throughout the United States in places, yes. For example. Another concentration of Haitians is New York.
Yes, indeed. Miami has the highest concentration of Haitians than any other places in the U.S. So, of course, many of the TPS holders, 40% of them, do live in Miami. And Little Haiti is a place that has been built by immigrants when Haitians were freed in the late 70s, early 80s, they were, set free in Little Haiti, which was a very depressed and drug-infested area at the time. But through resilience and determination and hard work, Haitian immigrants have turned Little Haiti into a vibrant, culturally diverse, and culturally rich neighborhood, which is considered probably the fastest gentrified area in the U.S. So we are facing the hard process of gentrification. At the same time, we are also risking, being deported to a country that is, in trouble right now.
Why the change of heart? Can you talk about the Trump administration's reversal, what it looks like from the Obama administration?
Well, then candidate Trump, now President Trump, did promise to be Haitians, greatest champion. And a lot of Haitians, I guess some voted for him, and we are all expecting him to do the right thing. We hope that he will do the right thing because, sending all these people back to Haiti will be a travesty. Because he did promise, and then these people have created a life here, and then they send remittances to at least 500,000 people in Haiti. It is in the best interest, the national interest of the U.S. for the 50,000 plus Haitians to remain here, continue to contribute socially, financially, and otherwise, and then keep these remittances flowing so that people will not risk their lives to come here as a result of these, waves of deportation. So it is in the best interest of the U.S. to keep the Haitians here, allow them to continue living here with their families. Plus, it is the humane thing to do. And President Trump needs to keep his promise, because in Creole we say a promise is a debt. Promesse, c'est dette. A promise is a debt.
About 500 Walt Disney World employees could be impacted by the looming removal. Can you talk about Disney World in Orlando coming out for the continuation of TPS?
Yes, so the CEOs of Disney World did come out over a week ago advocating for TPS because they have over 500 employees who have been model employees because Haitian immigrants, like most immigrants in this country, are hard-working people. They work 2-3 jobs and they have strong work ethics. So we are very encouraged by the decision of Disney World to come out in support of temporary protected status, and we hope that the chambers of commerce and other employers, who some of them are already laying people off, they will, heed the call of Disney World to keep these people employed and then to put pressure on the Trump administration to renew TPS sooner than later, because the employers are getting the signal that it might not be renewed, and some people are being fired right now.
Both Disney and Unite Here, the union that represents many of the company's workers, again calling for extending the temporary protected status. This is Walt Disney Company in a statement saying, quote, "Given the current situation in Haiti, we support efforts to extend the temporary protected status for Haitian nationals. The more than 500 cast members who are currently part of this program have been and are an important part of our Walt Disney World workforce in Central Florida." Also, legislators, Congress members. Marlene, can you talk about what their response is right now, both Republican and Democrat?
Indeed, the entire Florida delegations and lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have advocated for the renewal of TPS. So they've written letters, and now we are encouraging them to pick up the phone, because now we're beyond letters right now. They've been very supportive thus far, but now they need to go up a notch. So in Florida, we are focusing on Senator Bill Nelson and Senator Marco Rubio to pick up the phone and then call Mr. Trump and President Trump and ask him to renew TPS now. And we also encourage listeners and TV viewers to also do their part by tweeting, supporting us on social media, hashtag renew TPS now and yes for TPS. We need to get this done because it is only fair. It is only also the human thing to do.
Marlene Bastien, I want to thank you for being with us, giving a sense as we travel this country, covering the movements that are changing America, what's happening here in Florida. Marlene Bastien, Executive Director of Haitian Women of Miami. Thank you. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we speak with Anand Gopal, who has covered the Middle East for years, talking about what's happening in Syria. Stay with us.
Vous partagez comme des mots sauvagés, qu'il y a un bagage qui dit, ou entraîne dans la vie, ou été, c'est un genre moins senti, en gros feeling envahit, chérie, bagage menti non ça. Je bouge là toujours, puis fait toujours sous l'amour. Le temps la pluie paraît pour nous. L'amour prend chemin, la boue. Doit souvent oublier dire.
Okay. No Lies in This by Emeline Michel, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're on the road today in Tampa, Florida. I'll be speaking at the Seminole Church in Tampa tonight. We're broadcasting from Tampa PBS WEDU. President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed Tuesday during a phone call to work together to seek a ceasefire in Syria. According to the Kremlin, Putin and Trump agreed to meet in July to discuss a resolution to the protracted conflict. The phone call came the same day ISIS militants attacked a makeshift camp for displaced Syrians and Iraqi refugees, killing nearly 40 civilians and Kurdish fighters near Syria's northeastern border with Iraq. Meanwhile, Human Rights Watch has concluded Syrian government forces have used chemical nerve agents such as sarin gas in attacks at least 4 times in recent months, including in the April attack that killed 86 people, including dozens of children. Human Rights Watch said new evidence, including photos and videos of weapon remnants, suggests the April attack came from a Soviet-made airdrop chemical bomb specifically designed to deliver sarin. One of the other attacks on December 12th reportedly killed 64 people. The Syrian government's denied using chemical weapons. Meanwhile, U.S.-led coalition airstrikes continue in Syria. The journalistic monitoring group Air Wars says these airstrikes reportedly killed at least 24 civilians in the final week of April in and around Raqqa. Almost 500,000 people have been killed in the war in Syria, which has entered its 7th year, with more than 6 million Syrians displaced inside Syria and 5 million Syrian refugees living outside Syria's borders. Democracy Now!'s Nermeen Sheikh and I recently spoke about Syria with Anand Gopal, a well-known journalist who's lived in the Middle East for years, fellow at the Nation Institute, has reported extensively from the region. Anand Gopal is the author of No Good Men Among the Living, America, the Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes. He began by talking about the U.S. policy in Syria.
Well, I think it's important to understand that there's no regime change policy from the United States towards Syria, and there has never been a regime change policy. The Obama administration has said numerous times Assad must go, but what they mean is Assad should step down and somebody else in the regime should take over, and there should be a continuation of the regime in the interest of stability, and I put that in quotes because stability from their point of view, and in the interest of fighting terrorism. This is essentially the model that took place in Yemen, where you had the dictator step down, but you had the continuation of the dictatorship in a way. It's also really a continuation of what happened in Egypt. And that's been the goal from the beginning. And so the U.S. has never actually pursued a policy of regime change. If you want to see how regime change looks, so you can look at how the U.S. did that in Afghanistan in the 1980s, or even in 2001 in the air war. Neither of those have actually taken place in Syria.
Well, so in that sense, Russia and the United States are in agreement, in other words, that they would rather retain Assad himself or someone from his regime as the head of state or in control of Syria because of fears of who might take over in the event that he goes or that his regime goes.
Exactly. I mean, I would say the only difference between Russia and the United States is Russia probably wants Assad himself to continue, whereas the United States is more interested in stability and wanting the regime to continue. And we see this in many ways. For example, there's cases where when there's rebel groups that are fighting against the regime and they're getting weapons and funding from the United States, the U.S. will cut off funding to them unless they focus their fighting on ISIS only. This has happened numerous times. And these groups have lost their funding, and then once they're bereft of support, they went and joined al-Qaeda. So there's a narrative here that says that the U.S. is supporting extremists and al-Qaeda groups. It's actually false. In fact, the U.S. is punishing groups that are trying to fight Assad, and when those groups are being punished, then they're going and joining al-Qaeda or extremist groups.
But they are supporting the YPG, the Kurdish militia force that is fighting the Assad regime.
Absolutely. The closest ally of the U.S. in Syria is a left-wing group called the YPG, and they are the main force which is fighting ISIS right now.
And talk about who they are.
The YPG is essentially an offshoot of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is a group in Turkey which has been waging essentially a left-wing insurgency against the Turkish government for Kurdish rights for decades. And in the last 3 or 4 years, they've expanded extraordinarily rapidly in Syria. They have set up these councils all across northern and eastern Syria, and they've become the main partners of the United States in this battle against ISIS. So the battle for Raqqa, which is the de facto capital of the caliphate, it's the YPG who is the main ally of the United States.
And can you say a little, Anand, about what the impact of the Russian military intervention in Syria has been in terms of the situation on the ground, in terms of civilian casualties, and so on?
Well, in any discussion of Syria, it's important to state at the outset that the two biggest sources of violence in the country, number one is the Assad regime, which has just killed an incredible number of civilians, tortured, maimed, executed, anybody who resists, essentially. And the second biggest source of violence in Syria is the Russian regime. And Russia's role has been essentially to prop up the Syrian government at a time when it was looking very weak. When the Syrian government retook Aleppo a few months ago, they would not have been able to do that without Russian air power.
Well, last week, Democracy Now! Spoke to former Guardian Moscow correspondent Jonathan Steele. He questioned whether the Assad regime was responsible for the chemical attack in Idlib in Syria earlier this month, saying the principal beneficiaries were the U.S. military-industrial complex and those in the Trump administration wanting to prove the president is not a puppet of Putin. He went on to outline the benefits to the opposition groups in Syria from the chemical weapons attack.
The third group that's really benefited are the armed opposition to Assad, because they've suddenly got a new lease of life when it looked as though they were on the verge of losing their last sliver of territory around Idlib in northwest Syria. They've been given the option, perhaps the option of being defended militarily by NATO with airstrikes. They've had one airstrike and they're obviously hoping for more. And they're certainly not going to compromise in the Geneva talks. So everybody who's benefited is on the non-Syrian, non-Russian side.
So that's former Guardian Moscow correspondent Jonathan Steele speaking on Democracy Now! Last week. So, Anand, can you comment on what he said and the speculation amongst certain people that the Assad regime could not have been responsible for the chemical weapons attack because it didn't benefit from it? And it had already, in fact, the Assad regime is winning the war, so why would they do something like this, use chemical weapons?
The principal beneficiary of the chemical attacks was the people who carried it out, which was the Assad regime. You have to understand, this comes in the context of just a week before that, you had statements from the American administration, from Tillerson and from Trump, saying that Syrian questions up to Syrians to decide, which is an implicit way of saying that even our very weak statement prior to this, that Assad must go, even that we're dropping. So he was now operating from a position of what he sees as basically impunity, and that's it was under those conditions under which he carried out the chemical attack. It's also coming under the circumstances that Russia was drawn closer to the YPG and was also having a rapprochement of sorts with Turkey, which is backing some elements of the FSA. And there's speculation that the Assad regime carried out this attack as a way to force Russia back firmly in its corner.
Can you talk about why the United States, why you feel Tillerson and Nikki Haley made these comments saying that the Syrian people should determine who is their president, signaling some kind of change in U.S. policy, not as if President Obama took out Assad, but had a different rhetoric around it?
Well, I think this has been the logical culmination of 8 years of Obama's policy in the Middle East. And Obama said again and again that Assad must go, but didn't give the opposition the means to actually make that happen. And in fact, did spend most of his time policing the opposition to make sure that Assad wouldn't be ejected. When the Trump administration took office, they dispensed with that formality. And they said, look, our focus is ISIS. We don't even need to talk about having Assad go. And that's what that signaled, which was that, look, we just need to focus on ISIS, and Assad can stay as long as he wants, essentially. That was the message that was sent to the regime, and it's not a surprise that a week later you saw a chemical attack.
Well, I mean, the Russians themselves have said more or less similar things, namely that it's up to the Syrians to decide what happens after Assad, that their explicit goal is not retaining Assad. So last week, Democracy Now! Spoke to Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at Princeton, Stephen Cohen. He explained why the Russians were backing the Assad regime.
I would ask all these Americans who vilify Assad, I would ask all your listeners and viewers, if you destroy the Syrian state, who's going to do the fighting against terrorists in Syria? Are you going to ask Russia to send troops? Are we going to send troops? So for Russia, and this is the point, it's not Assad. They could give a hoot about what happens to him and their family. It's what happens to the Syrian state. And that's why they will stand with Assad until there is some kind of military victory, and then a so-called political peace process begins, and then Assad's on his own.
So that was Stephen Cohen speaking last week on Democracy Now! So Anand, can you comment specifically on what he said, and also this idea that both the U.S. and Russia have, that the Syrians will be able to decide for themselves, despite the fact that for decades Syrians have not been able to decide for themselves?
Well, it's interesting because what he said is basically a perfect summary of American policy in Syria, not actually Russian policy. And Syria is a dictatorship. Syrians do not have the ability to decide. When they wanted to try to decide for themselves, they had a revolution. And so when people say it's up to Syrians themselves to decide, when Russia or the United States says that, it's a coded way of backing the Assad regime. And, you know, he said that the Assad regime is the main force fighting terrorism in Syria, and that's absolutely false. The regime does not fight terrorism. It's actually the single biggest cause of terrorism in Syria. It is the cause of ISIS in Syria. And if you talk to Syrians, Bashar al-Assad and the regime is the biggest terrorist in the country. The force that's actually fighting ISIS, which I assume is what he's referring to, is the YPG, which is backed by the United States.
Can you explain what you mean by that, that the cause of ISIS, or what gave birth to ISIS in Syria, is in fact the Assad regime, because that's not what's commonly understood?
Well, I've spent a good portion of the last few months actually interviewing a number of ISIS fighters and defectors from ISIS. And one of the things I've made a point to do is actually ask them, why did you join this group, you know? And to a person, they all say they witnessed some horrific atrocity or massacre conducted by the regime. I've never heard anybody give another reason other than that. And so what has happened is that the sheer brutality of the regime has led some people to join ISIS, especially in the context where they see there's not a lot of support for other groups. And you have to remember, ISIS is one of the few groups in Syria that doesn't get foreign support. It's almost entirely self-funded, which gives it a sort of staying power that some of the FSA groups don't have.
And is it your sense that ISIS's power or control over Syria is weakening?
It's absolutely weakening. Again, not because of the Assad regime, but in spite of the Assad regime. It's weakening because, for the most part, because of the YPG. But we should also look back a couple of years ago when ISIS was taking over broad swaths of territory near Aleppo and pushing into Idlib. It was the Free Syrian Army and their allies that actually pushed ISIS back into eastern Syria.
Well, can you talk about the gas attack? What you actually think happened? You have Assad saying, not only didn't the Syrian regime do this, but he says he doesn't even believe that the children were dying.
So to start with, we know that the children died. We know through investigative reports that they died of sarin. And we also know that there was a airstrike that took place. The claim by Russian intelligence and by the Assad regime was that this was an airstrike on a warehouse that contained chemical weapons, and those chemical weapons were being stockpiled by the opposition. We've had many Syrians actually go to the site to photograph this and show that the warehouse was never struck, and they have actually photographed the actual point of the impact of the bomb, which is in the street, not in the warehouse. We've also had a Guardian reporter go to this area and do the same thing. And also, you have to remember, the regime has actually carried out numerous chemical attacks against its own people, so this is nothing new. The idea that the opposition somehow stockpiled chemical weapons and waited for the regime to strike it so that it could then use it to its benefit, that's just a conspiracy theory, and in my view, that's on the level of Bigfoot or UFOs.
Anand Gopal, journalist and fellow at the Nation Institute, who's reported extensively from the Middle East. We'll post our full interview with Anand at DemocracyNow.org. When we come back, we go back to North Carolina to look at how a group of African-American residents are fighting against factory farms that spray liquid hog manure on their communities. Stay with us.
Who may reach for the stars, others will end behind bars. What the future has in store, no one ever knows before. Though time may help you forget all that has happened before, it's too late to regret what is gone will be no more. Tomorrow is my turn, no more doubts, no more fears. Tomorrow is my turn, when my luck is returning. All these years I've been learning.
Tomorrow is My Turn by Rhiannon Giddens, a North Carolina musician. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting today from Tampa, Florida, from Tampa PBS, WEDU. I'm Amy Goodman. We close today's show with a look at the battle between residents of eastern North Carolina and one of the state's largest industries, hog farms. Last week, the North Carolina lawmakers passed House Bill 467, which limits the damages that residents can collect against hog farms. The billion-dollar industry is primarily clustered in the eastern part of North Carolina, where hog farms collect billions of gallons of untreated pig feces and urine in what are essentially cesspools, then dispose of the waste by spraying it into the air. In an investigation into the industry, filmmaker Mark DeVries used drones to capture aerial footage of several massive facilities that supply pigs for Smithfield Foods. He spoke with Steve Wing, associate professor of epidemiology at the University of North Carolina's Giddings School of Public Health, who described what happens in the facilities.
The waste falls through the floors. It's flushed out into an open pit, like a cesspool. It's easy for a big hog operation to have as much waste as a medium-sized city. Of course, the pit will fill up, so it has to be emptied, and they're emptied by spraying the liquid waste.
Yes, you heard that right.
If you're familiar with a garden sprayer, they're gigantic versions of that, so they're making droplets, fine mists out of this liquid waste, and that can drift downwind into the neighboring communities.
Residents living in the area of the spray complain of odors so bad it limits their ability to be outdoors and adverse health effects. House Bill 467, or the Agriculture and Forestry Nuisance Remedies Bill, was introduced by Republican State Representative Jimmy Dixon, a longtime farmer who's received campaign contributions from the hog industry. Speaking at a hearing about the legislation, Dixon said, quote, "These claims are at best enormous exaggerations and at worst outright lies. Is there some odor? Yes. But I would like you to close your eyes and imagine how ham and sausage and eggs and fried chicken smell," he said. The legislation comes as a class action suit brought by nearly 500 primarily African-American residents of eastern North Carolina seek financial compensation from Murphy Brown, the state's largest hog producer. The lawsuits have now moved to federal court. Well, for more, we're joined by Naima Muhammad, organizing co-director for the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. And we're joined by Will Hendrick, staff attorney with the Waterkeeper Alliance and manager of the organization's North Carolina Pure Farms, Pure Waters campaign. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin with Naima. Can you tell us where you live and what you're dealing with today?
Yes, okay. I live in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, which is in the eastern part of the state, but I'm in the northeastern part of the state. I live away from where these animals are, but I work with communities that's living with these animals, and I've been working with these communities since 1999. And so I'm constantly going into the communities where these animals are, and and I smell what the people living there are smelling. I see the spraying going on. I see the hog houses and the open air lagoons that's just sitting out there. As you travel through those communities, you can't help but see these houses that the animals are kept in, as well as the lagoons and the spray fields.
So I want to turn to another clip from Mark DeVries' video. Here he speaks with Elsie Herring, a resident of Wallace, North Carolina. She's part of the complaint filed with the EPA seeking more protections for neighbors of hog farm operations.
This is where they spray animal waste on us. This is about 8 feet from my mother's house.
What is it like when the mist is?
It's like, you think it's raining?
Really?
You think it's raining. We don't open the doors of the windows, but the odor still comes in. It takes your breath away. Then you start gagging, you get headaches.
And I want to turn to former pig factory farm owner Don Webb.
I shut my hog operation down, and I got out of it. And I just couldn't do another person that way to make them smell that. It is a cesspool that you put feces and urine in, a hole in the ground that you dump a toxic waste in. And I've seen dead hogs in them and stuff like that. I've seen it. I've talked to the people. I've seen the little children that say, "Mom and Daddy, why we got to smell this stuff?" You get stories like, "I can't hang my clothes out. Feces and urine odor comes by and attaches itself to your clothes." And then people will say, "We're scared to invite neighbors."
So that's former pig factory farmer Don Webb, who closed his farm. Naima, explain exactly what is in the spray that people are inhaling and getting on their clothes, the residents in East North Carolina?
Okay, so the spray is the animal waste that comes out of the hogs are kept in tent metal housing, and they have slacks in the floor where whenever they go to the bathroom or abort baby piglets or whatever happens with them, it falls through the slacks in the floor and it's piped out. There are pipes running underneath the ground, and the waste is piped out into the open air lagoon. And there are all kinds of chemicals. And this urine and fecal matter produces methane, ammonia gases, and so you can smell it. And what people say, it smells like rotten eggs, sometimes rotten collard greens, or it's just a terrible smell. And they have been forced off of their wells because they were seeing remnants of the waste in their well waters by the coloring and the odors coming out of their well water.
So, Will Hendrick, you're an attorney with Waterkeeper Alliance. Can you describe how extensive this is, how many people are affected, and what the State Carolina Legislature House Bill 467 is all about?
Certainly. This bill is an attempt to protect polluters over people, to deny rights to the victims of nuisance caused by agricultural operations, and to indeed deny equal rights to those who are disproportionately affected by those nuisance conditions. The question of the scope of agricultural operations is an important one, because the state of North Carolina, unfortunately, does not know the location, its own environmental agency does not know the location of many of the poultry operations that are in this state. Often, they are co-located with the hog operations we've been discussing. As you alluded to, the hog operations are predominantly concentrated in low-income and minority communities, predominantly in southeastern North Carolina. And the residents near these facilities experience significant impacts to their quality of life, many of which Naima discussed. But it is important to note that this bill would reduce remedies, would reduce property rights for nuisance victims across the state, because it applies to any nuisance caused by any agricultural or forestry operation, which do span from the mountains to the coast.
Why isn't this act illegal?
Well, there are certainly concerns regarding its legality, and ultimately that may be tested in the courts. What we have heard from bill proponents is that they believe this law is necessary to protect small farmers from frivolous lawsuits filed by out-of-state interests seeking to bleed the industry dry, and none of those four features is accurate. First, none of the pending lawsuits are against small farmers. They're instead against the large billion-dollar corporation that is producing this meat. Secondly, there are existing statutory protections against malicious or frivolous lawsuits filed in nuisance against agricultural operations. Third, the lawsuits are being brought by North Carolina lawyers based in Salisbury, North Carolina. And fourth, and most importantly, the attempt here is not to drive this industry out of North Carolina. Agriculture has been and will continue to be an important part of our economy. However, no industry is worth the impacts on public health and the environment that we have seen in this industry. And so the attempt here is not to bleed that industry dry, but instead to make sure that that industry is conducted, that these operations are managing waste in a way that doesn't harm their neighbors.
I want to go to another clip from Mark DeVries's investigation into Smithfield Foods factory farms. This is Steve Wing, Associate Professor of Epidemiology at the University of North Carolina's Giddings School of Public Health.
It can, I think, very correctly be called environmental racism or environmental injustice, that people of color, low-income people, bear the brunt of these practices.
So, Will Hendrick, this bill, HB 467, was passed by both houses of the North Carolina legislature. It now goes to be signed by the new Democratic governor, Cooper. What is your understanding of what he will do?
Well, we are urging him to veto this legislation. And of course, that decision is his, and he has to act by this Sunday. We're hoping that he'll step in and be the champion of the people that he campaigned to be. We saw in the McCrory administration concerns about willingness to protect corporate interests over the people of North Carolina. And the coal ash saga was an important part of the electoral season and the campaign dialogue. Similarly, we saw concern by North Carolina voters in response to attempts to decrease the civil rights of many North Carolinians in the HB2 fiasco. Governor Cooper rose to power, was put into office by North Carolinians believing that he would be a champion for the little guy, that he would not kowtow to these large corporations, that he would not solely be the governor for the well-heeled, but be the governor for all Tar Heels in the Tar Heel state.
A Republican North Carolina State Representative Jimmy Dixon is a primary sponsor of HB 467, or the Agriculture and Forestry Nuisance Remedies Bill, again, which would limit damages people could collect against hog farms. Dixon is a longtime farmer who received more than $100,000 in contributions from the pork industry over the last 5 years, including contributions from Bill Prestage, who served on the board of Smithfield, Wendell Murphy Jr. of Murphy Family Ventures, one of the county's largest pork producers, and the North Carolina Pork Council. Can you talk about the significance of this and just exactly who makes up the pig manure lobby?
Certainly. There are an army of individuals that make up that lobby, and listing all of their names would be impossible on this segment. Suffice it to say that there are various interests working to protect the hog industry, the poultry industry, agribusiness in this state. North Carolina is the second leading producer of pork in this country, behind only Iowa. And so there is significant interest by the industry in ensuring that they can operate with minimized exposure to liability. And indeed, they've externalized the costs of waste management, and they're attempting here to reduce the rights of people who are going to court, saying that they are harmed by the way in which waste is managed at these operations, and that they have property rights recognized, gosh, since 1611, back in Old England, and that those rights deserve protection, and that there should be remedies in courts in North Carolina when those rights are violated.
Naima Mohammed, I wanted to ask you if you can talk more about the class action suit against Smithfield by those affected by the farms, and your organization also filing a Title VI complaint with the EPA. Explain what that means.
Okay, so the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, Waterkeeper Alliance, and REACH, which is Rural Empowerment Association for Community Help, we joined together and filed a Title VI complaint, which is an act under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And under the Title VI, it states that governmental agencies cannot do business in a way that intentionally or unintentionally have a disproportionate impact on low-income communities. And so in March of 2013, DEQ, which is Department of Environmental Quality, at that time it was called the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, renewed all of those contract growers' permits without putting any protective measures in place for communities living with these animals, even though they had been well informed of the health impacts, the environmental impacts, by the research that was done by Dr. Steve Wing, and also citizens going up, talking with them. They attended the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. We have an annual summit every year, the third weekend in October, and Dina always had a representative sitting on our government listening panel. So they were in the room.
Naima, we're going to have to leave it there as the show wraps up, but we're going to continue to follow this issue. Naima Mohammed, organizing co-director for the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, and Will Hendrick, attorney with Waterkeeper Alliance, and manager of the organization's North Carolina Pure Farms, Pure Waters campaign. That does it for the show. I'll be speaking tonight in Tampa, 7:30 at the Seminole Heights United Methodist Church. Thursday in Atlanta, 7 p.m. at the First Iconium Baptist Church. Friday at 2 at Carleton College in Minnesota, 6:30 at Augsburg College in Minneapolis. On Saturday, we're in Madison. At night, we're in Chicago. On Sunday, we're in 3 cities in Michigan. That does it for the show. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.